In the unforgiving heart of the American West, where the sun bakes secrets into the cracked earth, and every shadow hides a vulture or a villain, a man can lose his soul as easily as his horse. Jedediah Stone was such a man, a cowboy adrift in a sea of silent grief, his heart a barren landscape. He rode seeking nothing but the end of the trail. But on a blistering afternoon, in the wretched town of Redemption Gulch, he found something he never looked for: a woman, her spirit nearly broken, begging in the dust with 3 identical crying babies. He thought offering a coin would be the end of it. He was wrong. That single act of pity wasn't an end, but a beginning, the start of a firestorm that would unearth a deadly secret, pit him against a devil in a black hat, and force him to confront the ghosts he'd long since buried. This is the story of how a broken cowboy, an orphaned mother, and 3 helpless children changed the fate of a town and forged a new destiny from the ashes of despair. The year is 1884. The heat in Redemption Gulch wasn't just a physical force, it was a malevolent presence. It shimmered off the beaten dirt of the main street, warped the facades of the false-fronted buildings, and seemed to suck the very hope from the air. For Jedediah "Jed" Stone, it was just another shade of the emptiness he carried inside him. Jed was a man carved from the rugged landscape he traversed. His face was a road map of hard miles and harder memories, tanned to the color of worn leather by a relentless sun. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, held a permanent squint, not just from the glare, but from a deep-seated weariness with the world. He rode into town on a bay gelding named Ghost, the horse's gait as steady and unhurried as Jed's own heartbeat. He needed supplies, flour coffee, cartridges, the holy trinity of a solitary life. He planned to be in and out before the dust he kicked up had a chance to settle. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude. 5 years ago, a cholera epidemic back in Kansas had stolen his world, his wife Mary, and their infant son Lucas. The grief had been a physical blow, knocking the foundations out from under him. He'd sold the farm strapped on a Colt peacemaker he barely knew how to use, and ridden west seeking a place so empty it would match the void in his chest. He'd found it in the vast, silent plains and the jagged mountains of the territory. He worked odd jobs, ranch hand, trail scout, even a brief, ill-advised stint as a guard for a mining company. But he never stayed long. Attachments were anchors, and he was determined to remain adrift. As he swung down from Ghost in front of Miller's General Store, a sound snagged his attention, cutting through the usual town noise of clanking blacksmith hammers and boisterous saloon chatter. It was the thin, reedy cry of a baby. Then another. And another. The sounds were weak, laced with a desperation that plucked at a string deep inside Jed he thought had long since snapped. His eyes followed the sound to the sliver of shade beside the store. There, huddled against the rough timber wall, was a woman. She couldn't have been much older than 25, but exhaustion and sorrow had etched years onto her face. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was now faded, patched, and coated in the same fine red dust that covered everything. Her dark hair had escaped its bun, framing a face of stark, tragic beauty. Her olive skin and dark, almond-shaped eyes suggested she was Italian, a rarity this far west. But it wasn't just her that held Jed's gaze. It was the 3 small bundles cradled in and around her lap. Triplets. 2 boys and a girl from the looks of their threadbare blankets. Their faces were pinched and red, their cries a heartbreaking symphony of hunger and discomfort. The woman, Isabella Rossi, whispered to them in a soft, melodic tongue, her voice cracking with unshed tears. An old battered tin cup sat on the ground before her, empty save for a single mocking fly. Jed watched as townsfolk passed by. A woman in a fine bonnet pulled her child closer and hurried past. 2 cattlemen swaggered out of the saloon, laughing, and didn't even grant the family a glance. The town's sheriff, a portly man named Brody with a drooping mustache and a tin star that seemed too heavy for his chest, walked right by his expression, one of mild annoyance. This was the way of the world, Jed knew. People looked after their own. Weakness was a disease, and no one wanted to catch it. His own instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, screamed at him to walk away. Not your business, not your trouble. He had his own ghosts to wrestle. He didn't need to take on someone else's. He turned toward the store's entrance, his jaw set. He could almost feel Mary's disappointed gaze on him. She had been the heart of their home, a woman whose kindness was as boundless as the Kansas sky. She would have stopped. She would have helped. Cursing under his breath, Jed stopped. The cries of the infants seemed to intensify, burrowing into his conscience like ticks. He couldn't shake the image of his own son Lucas, wrapped in a similar blanket, his life extinguished before it had truly begun. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 5 years of solitude, he turned back. He walked over to the woman, his boots scuffing in the thick dust. Her head snapped up, her dark eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and defiance. She pulled her children closer, a lioness protecting her cubs, however weak she might be. Jed didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket, his calloused fingers fumbling past loose cartridges until they found the small pouch of coins. He pulled out a silver dollar. It was more than he could comfortably spare, a significant chunk of his supply money. He squatted down his knees, cracking in protest, and gently placed the coin in the tin cup. The woman Isabella stared at the silver disc as if it were a burning coal. Tears welled in her eyes, and finally spilled over, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "God bless you, sir," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My boys, my little girl, they haven't had milk in 2 days." Jed just nodded, his throat tight. He was about to stand up and walk away. His duty done, the ghost of his wife momentarily appeased. But then one of the baby boys, his tiny face screwed up in misery, reached out a minuscule hand, his fingers brushing against Jed's worn leather glove. It was nothing. A random infantile movement. But for Jed it was like a lightning strike. In that fleeting touch, he felt the ghost of his son's hand in his, felt the staggering weight of a life that never was. The fortress he had built around his heart didn't just crack. A whole section of the wall crumbled to dust. He looked from the baby's hand to the mother's desperate, tear-filled eyes. He saw the raw, gaping wound of her loss mirrored in them. He knew that look. It was the same one that greeted him in his shaving mirror every morning. He knew this silver dollar was just a drop of water on a raging fire. It would buy a day, maybe 2. But the sun would rise again, the dust would still blow, and the hunger would return. And the man who ran this town, like his own personal fiefdom, Silas Kane, was not known for his charity. Silas Kane. The name left a bitter taste in Jed's mouth. A cattle baron who owned the largest ranch in the territory, the saloon, the hotel, and held the mortgage on half the businesses in Redemption Gulch, including Miller's store. Kane was a man whose power was absolute and whose cruelty was legendary. Jed had heard stories of him starving out homesteaders, who wouldn't sell their land of his hired guns, making dissenters disappear. A woman begging on his street was a blight on his perfect canvas of control. Her continued presence would not be tolerated for long. "What's your name?" Jed asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Isabella. Isabella Rossi," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "These are my sons, Samuel and Daniel, and this is my daughter Eliana." "Where's your husband?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. A fresh wave of pain washed over her face. "Antonio. My Antonio is dead. A fever 3 months past. It took him in a week. He built our cabin out by the creek. But when he died, Mr. Kane's men came. They said Antonio owed him money. They took everything. The cabin, our mule, our tools. They burned it to the ground. Said we were squatters." The casual cruelty of it made Jed's blood run cold. He looked at the 3 innocent lives born into a world that had already dealt them an impossible hand. Leaving them here wasn't just walking away from a stranger's trouble. It was leaving them to die. Sheriff Brody wouldn't help. The townsfolk were too scared of Kane. In that moment, Jedediah Stone made a decision that went against every instinct he had cultivated for 5 long years. He was no hero. He was just a man tired of running from ghosts who suddenly found himself face to face with a living, breathing reason to stand still. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and firm, his pale blue eyes meeting her dark, tear-filled ones. "Get your children. You're not staying here." Isabella stared at him, her expression a whirlwind of shock, confusion, and a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. Where would we go?" "With me," Jed said the words, feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "My cabin is a 2-hour ride from here. It ain't much, but it's safe. There's a roof and a fire, and food." He stood up, offering her a hand. For a long moment she hesitated, her gaze searching his face for any sign of malice or deceit. She saw only a profound sadness, a weariness that matched her own, and a resolve that was as solid as the mountains on the horizon. Slowly, tentatively, she placed her small, dirt-smudged hand into his large, calloused one. As Jed helped her to her feet, the weight of her hand felt both strange and terrifyingly familiar. He didn't know it then, but as he helped Isabella and her 3 children gather their meager belongings, he wasn't just lifting them out of the dust. He was stepping into the heart of a storm, a conflict far deeper and more dangerous than a simple dispute over land. He was taking the first step on a path that would lead to a confrontation with the devil of Redemption Gulch and force him to unearth a secret buried with Isabella's husband, a secret that people would kill for. His life of quiet solitude was over, shattered forever by the cries of 3 orphans and the touch of a desperate mother's hand. The ride to Jed's cabin was a study in tense silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic clop of ghosts' hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the occasional soft coo from one of the babies. Jed had purchased a few essentials from Miller's canned milk oats and a bolt of flannel before loading his new companions. He had situated Isabella on his horse, a baby nestled in each of her arms, while he walked alongside carrying the 3rd in a makeshift sling against his chest. The warmth and weight of the child, little Eliana, was a constant unnerving presence. Each soft breath she took against his shirt seemed to echo the phantom breaths of the son he'd lost. He kept his face a stoic mask, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but inside a tempest of emotion was brewing. This was a mistake. a fool's errand born of a moment's weakness. These people were not his responsibility. His cabin was nestled in a small hidden valley, shielded by a stand of tall pines and the granite shoulder of a mountain. It was a simple one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs with a stone fireplace, a sturdy door, and 2 small windows. It was a fortress of solitude designed for one. Now it felt impossibly small. As they arrived, Isabella slid stiffly from the saddle, her body aching from the ride and the strain of holding her sons. She looked at the cabin, then at the vast, lonely wilderness surrounding them. Fear warred with relief in her eyes. "It's quiet," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's safe," Jed replied gruffly, trying to re-establish the distance between them. "Safer than town." The first few days were an awkward dance of strangers forced into intimacy. Jed was a man of few words, and his quiet nature was often mistaken for anger. He would chop wood with a ferocity that seemed to channel some inner rage, or stare into the fire for hours lost in thoughts he never shared. Isabella, for her part, was determined not to be a burden. Once she had a little food in her belly, and the babies were fed and sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, a quiet strength began to emerge. She was meticulously clean, scrubbing the cabin's floor until the wood gleamed. She mended Jed's worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Her hands, though chapped and raw, were never idle. She had a gentle humming way about her as she worked, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence Jed was used to. The triplets were a force of nature. Their needs were constant and overwhelming, feeding, cleaning, comforting. Jed, who had planned on observing from a safe emotional distance, found himself drawn in. He learned to distinguish their cries. Samuel's was a demanding roar, Daniel's a fretful whimper, and Eliana's a high-pitched plea. He found himself holding one of the boys on his lap, while Isabella tended to the others, his large, rough hands looking comical as they patted a tiny back. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and sending drafts through the chinks in the logs, Eliana began to cry inconsolably. Isabella tried everything, feeding, rocking, singing, but the baby's wails only grew more frantic. Jed watched from his corner, feeling useless. Then a memory surfaced: Mary, humming a specific tune to a colicky Lucas, a simple repetitive folk melody. Without thinking, he started to hum it. It was a low, rumbling sound in his chest, rusty from years of disuse. Isabella stopped her frantic rocking and looked at him surprised. The baby's cries began to soften her tiny body, relaxing at the strange, deep vibration. Jed kept humming, his eyes on the fire, a blush creeping up his neck. Slowly, Eliana's cries subsided into hiccups, and then finally she was asleep. A profound silence filled the room, broken only by the storm and the crackling fire. "Thank you," Isabella said softly. "You have a kind heart, Jedediah Stone, no matter how hard you try to hide it." Jed just grunted in response, but her words landed somewhere deep inside him. The embers of his humanity, long dormant and covered in ash, felt a faint, warm glow. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. Jed was returning from checking his snares, a pair of rabbits slung over his shoulder when he saw them. 2 riders sitting on their horses at the edge of the clearing, looking down at his cabin. Their silhouettes were unmistakable. They were Silas Kane's men, a lanky, weasel-faced man named Cletus, and a brutish, hulking figure known only as Boone. Jed's blood ran cold. He ducked behind a rock outcropping, his heart pounding. How had they found him? Had someone in town seen them leave? He watched as Boone dismounted and swaggered toward the cabin door. Jed's hand went instinctively to his Colt. He was a fair shot, but not against two men, one of whom was a known gunman. Boone hammered on the door with his fist. "Open up in there. We know you're in there. Rossi, woman." Inside, Jed could picture Isabella's terror. The babies would be silent, their mother's fear transmitted to them like a current. The door remained closed. Boone laughed, a cruel, ugly sound that carried on the wind. He put his shoulder to the door. The old wood groaned in protest. Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through Jed. This was his home, his sanctuary, and they were violating it, terrorizing the people he had sworn to protect. The ghosts of his past screamed in unison with the terror of the present. He would not stand by and watch another family be destroyed. He cocked his pistol, the sound a definitive click in the mountain silence. He stepped out from behind the rock. "I'd advise against that," Jed called out, his voice ringing with an authority that surprised even himself. Cletus and Boone spun around their hands, flying to their holsters. They saw Jed standing 100 yards away, pistol leveled, his face a mask of cold fury. "Well, looky here, Cletus." Boone sneered, though he made no move to draw. "It's the stray dog that picked up the bitch and her litter. This is my property," Jed said, his voice deadly calm. "You've got 10 seconds to get on your horses and ride out. 1. Cletus licked his lips nervously. "Now hold on, friend. We ain't got no quarrel with you. Mr. Kane just wants what's his. The woman's husband owed him a debt." "Her husband is dead," Jed bit back. "Whatever debt there was died with him. That's the law. 5. Mr. Kane makes his own law in these parts." Boone growled, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun. "Not on my land," Jed said. 8. The tension stretched taut. Jed's finger was tight on the trigger. He wasn't aiming to kill, but he would put a bullet in Boone's shoulder without a second thought. He saw a flicker of doubt in Boone's eyes. The big man was a bully used to intimidating unarmed homesteaders, not a man standing his ground with a steady gun. "Let's go, Boone," Cletus whined. "He ain't worth the trouble." Boone spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hatred. "This ain't over stone. Mr. Kane gets what he wants. Always." He lumbered back to his horse, mounted up, and the two men galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and menace in their wake. Jed stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving him trembling slightly. He had done it. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had publicly declared Isabella and her children under his protection. When he finally entered the cabin, Isabella was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale as a sheet, clutching a fireplace poker like a weapon. The babies were awake but silent, their wide eyes reflecting the fear in the room. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "They will be back," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Jed replied, holstering his pistol. "This isn't about a simple debt, is it? Isabella burning your cabin, sending men like that after you? There's something more. What aren't you telling me?" Isabella's composure finally broke. She sank onto a stool, the poker clattering to the floor. Tears streamed down her face. She looked at her 3 children sleeping fitfully in a cot Jed had fashioned from an old crate. "Because Antonio, my husband, he didn't just owe Mr. Kane money," she confessed, her voice choked with fear and long-held secrets. "He found something. Something Kane wants more than anything. And Antonio, he hid it before he died. He told me, It was the children's only inheritance, their only hope. And I think those men are willing to kill us all to get it. The revelation hung in the small cabin heavier and more suffocating than the smoke from the fireplace. Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He had stumbled out of one man's storm and into the eye of a hurricane. "What did he find?" Jed asked, his voice low. He stoked the fire, the simple domestic act, a stark contrast to the sudden danger that now filled their lives. Isabella wrung her hands, her gaze darting towards the sleeping triplets. "I don't know everything. Antonio wasn't a man for many words much like you," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "He was a farmer, but he had the heart of a prospector. He was always exploring the canyons, the dry riverbeds. He said this land held secrets." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. About 6 months ago, he came back to the cabin one night, his eyes wild with excitement. He was covered in dirt, his hands blistered, but he was grinning. He said he'd found it. He called it the Viridian Valley, a place hidden deep in the mesas, a place the sun had blessed. Jed listened intently. Land in this territory was either baked clay or barren rock. Water was more precious than gold. He said there was a spring, Isabella continued, her voice filled with a reverence she'd clearly inherited from her husband. A strong one that fed a creek running through a valley no wider than a mule but miles long. The soil was rich and black, not like the red dirt here. He said you could grow anything there. It was a paradise hidden away, protected by the rock formations. Enough water and fertile land to support a whole town, he said. Jed understood immediately. In a land ruled by a cattle baron, whose empire depended on controlling vast arid grazing lands and the few scattered water holes, a secret fertile valley with its own water source was a threat. It was also a prize of unimaginable value. "Cain owns the water rights for 100 miles in every direction," Jed said, thinking aloud. If another source appeared one he didn't control, his power would crumble. People wouldn't have to buy his water or lease his grazing land. "Exactly," Isabella affirmed. Antonio knew that. He went to see a land surveyor in the next county, an honest man named Peterson. He filed a claim legally and secretly. He paid for it with the last of our savings. The deed was his. It was ours. "So where is this deed?" Jed asked, the crucial question hanging in the air. Isabella's face clouded with sorrow. Antonio was so proud. He came back from the surveyor's office and went straight into town to register the claim at the local office to make it official in this county as well. That was his mistake. Sheriff Brody must have told Cain immediately. That very night, Cain and his men came to our cabin. They didn't come for a debt. They came for the deed. What happened? Antonio refused. He told Cain the land was for his family, for his future children. Cain laughed at him. He told Antonio that he owned the future in these parts. They beat him. Badly. Right in front of me. Isabella's voice broke, and she hugged herself tightly, reliving the horror. They tore the cabin apart, looking for the deed, but Antonio had hidden it well. They left warning him that he had 1 week to hand it over. But the beating, it weakened him. When the fever came a month later, he had no strength to fight it. A grim understanding settled over Jed. This wasn't just business for Silas Cain. It was personal. He'd been defied, and now he was tying up a loose end. "But he never gave them the deed," Jed stated. "Which means you have it." Isabella shook her head. No, after they left, Antonio knew he couldn't keep it. He told me he couldn't trust a piece of paper that Cain would find it eventually. He said he needed to hide it in a way no one would ever think to look. She looked over at the sleeping triplets, her expression a mixture of fierce love and profound fear. He told me, Isabella, our legacy is not in the ground, it's in our blood. It's in them. Jed frowned, not understanding. The children. Isabella stood up and walked over to the cot. With gentle, trembling fingers, she reached for a thin leather cord around Samuel's neck. Tucked beneath his flannel swaddling was a small, crudely made locket, fashioned from a polished river stone and a scrap of tin. She did the same for Daniel and then for Eliana. Each of the 3 babies had an identical locket. She brought them over to the table and, using the tip of a small knife, carefully pried one open. Jed leaned in closer. Inside there was no portrait, no lock of hair. Instead, pressed under a piece of scraped glass, was a tiny folded piece of parchment. It was a fragment of a map drawn in meticulous detail with waterproof ink. It showed topographical lines, rock formations, and a single cryptic symbol. Isabella opened the other 2 lockets. Each contained another piece of the map. My God, Jed breathed. He split the map into 3 pieces. And the deed itself, he asked. He burned it. Isabella said, her voice barely audible. He said the registered claim with Surveyor Peterson was the only one that mattered. This map is the only way to find the valley and prove the claim corresponds to that location. He knew. He knew no one would ever harm 3 newborn babies to get a map. He thought it was the perfect hiding place. A wave of cold dread washed over Jed. Antonio Rossi was a good man, a loving husband. But he had fatally underestimated the depravity of Silas Cain. He had seen the children as a shield. Cain would see them as nothing more than 3 inconvenient fleshy containers. He was wrong, Jed said, his voice grim. Cain won't hesitate. He's not after you, Isabella. He's after them. The full weight of their situation crashed down on Isabella. She stared at the 3 map fragments on the table, then at her sleeping children. Her husband's clever plan, his desperate attempt to secure their future, had instead marked them for death. She began to tremble, her face a mask of utter despair. What are we to do? She cried, her voice breaking into a sob. Where can we go? He will hunt us to the ends of the earth. Jed stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the dark, unforgiving night. His quiet life was a distant memory. He was now the guardian of a secret valley, a hunted woman and 3 infants who held the key. The choice he had made in the dust of Redemption Gulch had led him here to this impossible crossroads. He thought of Mary and Lucas, of the life he had lost. He had run from that pain for 5 years. But running now meant condemning this new fragile family to a fate he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. Cain wasn't just a greedy cattle baron. He was a cancer on this land, a man who snuffed out hope and life with casual indifference. Something inside Jed shifted. The embers of his old self warmed by Isabella's presence, and the touch of her children now caught fire. This was no longer just about protecting them. It was about fighting back. It was about justice for Antonio Rossi. And perhaps in some small way, it was about finding redemption for himself. He turned from the window, his pale blue eyes clear and hard with a newfound resolve. He looked at Isabella, whose tears had subsided into silent, fearful shudders. "We don't go anywhere," he said, his voice resonating with a strength she hadn't heard before. "We stop running. Your husband entrusted you with this secret, with their future. We're not going to let a man like Cain steal it." He walked to the table and carefully picked up the 3 pieces of the map. Antonio was a smart man. He created a key. Kane thinks he can break it. We're going to use it to lock him out forever. He looked at Isabella, his gaze unwavering. You need to tell me everything you remember about Antonio's dealings. Every name, every location. Kane has men and money. We have this, he said, holding up the map pieces. And we have the truth. It's time we figured out how to use it as a weapon. For the first time since her husband's death, Isabella felt a spark of something other than fear. It was a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling hope. She looked at this quiet, brooding cowboy, a man who had asked for nothing and was now risking everything. She nodded, wiping the tears from her eyes. I will, she said, her voice steady. I'll tell you everything. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the small cabin, a pact had been forged in the crucible of shared danger. The cowboy and the orphan were no longer just survivors. They were partners in a war they had to win. The days that followed were charged with a new urgent energy. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a war room. Jed and Isabella spent hours with the 3 map pieces spread on the table, trying to piece together Antonio's puzzle. The fragments were cleverly cut, not in simple squares, but along the contour lines of the terrain itself, making them difficult to align without a deep understanding of the local geography. Jed, who had spent years crisscrossing the territory, recognized some of the landmarks. That's Crow's Peak, he'd mutter, tracing a line with his finger. And this dry wash, it looks like the one they call Serpent's Spine. While Jed focused on the land, Isabella focused on the past. She recounted every detail she could remember about Antonio's conflict with Kane. She remembered Antonio mentioning that Kane's original land grants were questionable, that he'd used hired guns and crooked lawyers to expand his territory. He kept a ledger, Isabella said one evening, her eyes lighting up with a sudden memory. Antonio, he wasn't just a farmer. He could read and write English and Italian perfectly. He was methodical. When Kane's men started threatening other homesteaders, Antonio started making notes. Names, dates, what was taken. Where is this ledger? Jed asked, his pulse quickening. Isabella's face fell. It was in a lockbox in the cabin. It would have been destroyed in the fire. The setback was a blow, but it planted an idea in Jed's mind. Kane wasn't just a bully. He was a criminal. If they could find proof of his crimes, they could fight him with the law, not just with guns. Kane, however, was not a man to wait patiently. When his men didn't return with the woman and children, he escalated his campaign. The first move was subtle. When Jed rode into Redemption Gulch for supplies, leaving Isabella and the babies hidden and barricaded in the cabin, he found his world had shrunk. At Miller's general store, the usually amiable Mr. Miller couldn't meet his eye. Sorry, Jed, he mumbled, wiping down the counter. Kane's man came by. Said my loan's getting called in if I extend any more credit to you. It's cash on the barrelhead from now on. I got a family to think of. It was the same at the livery and the blacksmith's shop. Jed Stone was now a pariah. Kane was cutting him off, trying to starve him out. Jed paid with the last of his cash, his jaw tight with anger. As he was loading his supplies, Sheriff Brody swaggered over, his thumbs hooked in his belt. Stone, Brody said, his voice oozing false authority. Heard you're harboring a fugitive. That Rossi woman is wanted for questioning in her husband's affairs. Questioning about what? Jed shot back. How Kane's thugs beat him half to death. Brody's face turned red. You're walking a dangerous line. I could arrest you right now for obstruction. You could try, Jed said, his hand hovering near his Colt. But you and I both know who signs your paycheck, Brody. Now get out of my way. The sheriff, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He held Jed's gaze for a moment, then backed down, muttering threats under his breath. The encounter was a clear warning. The law in Redemption Gulch would be their enemy, not their shield. The pressure mounted. One morning, Jed discovered the creek near his cabin had been dammed upstream. A crude barrier of rocks and logs had reduced the flow to a mere trickle. It was Kane's work, another turn of the screw. It would take Jed a full day of back-breaking labor to clear it. The psychological toll was even greater. They felt besieged, trapped. The vast wilderness that had once been Jed's solace now felt like a prison. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a distant hawk sent a jolt of fear through them. During this time, the bond between Jed and Isabella deepened. They were no longer just allies. They were confidants, sharing stories of their past lives by the firelight. Jed spoke of Mary and Lucas, the words clumsy and painful at first, but the act of sharing the story seemed to loosen its suffocating grip on his soul. Isabella, in turn, described her life in Italy, her family's dream of a new life in America, a dream that had turned into a nightmare. They found a quiet rhythm. He taught her how to handle a rifle, her small hands surprisingly steady. She, in turn, brought a sense of home to his Spartan existence, the smell of baking bread occasionally chasing away the scent of gunpowder and old grief. The children, oblivious to the danger, grew and thrived under their combined care. Samuel was bold and curious, Daniel was quiet and watchful, and Eliana had a smile that could melt the winter snow. For Jed, they were becoming more than a responsibility. They were becoming his family. The breaking point came on a moonless night. Jed was awakened by a smell acrid smoke. He shot out of his cot, his heart hammering against his ribs. A hellish orange glow flickered outside the window. "Fire!" he yelled. Isabella was already awake, her face a mask of terror, gathering the startled babies from their crate. Jed threw open the door and was met with a wall of heat. The front of the cabin was ablaze. Kane's men had crept up in the night and thrown torches onto the roof and against the walls. "They're trying to burn us out, trap us inside," Jed yelled over the roar of the flames. Panic gave way to cold, desperate action. The main door was blocked by a curtain of fire. "The back window," Jed commanded. He smashed the small window pane with a chair, clearing out the jagged shards of glass. "You first," he ordered Isabella. "Hand me the children one by one." Isabella, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with terror, didn't hesitate. She passed a crying Samuel through the opening into Jed's waiting arms. He set the baby down on a patch of clear ground and turned back for the next. One by one, he got the triplets out. The smoke was thick in the cabin now, choking and blinding. "Now you, Isabella, go." Jed coughed, his lungs burning. She scrambled through the window, then turned to help him. As Jed was halfway through, a section of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and burning embers into the night sky. He threw himself the rest of the way out, his back seared by the intense heat. They huddled together on the ground, the four of them watching in horror as the home that had been their sanctuary was consumed by flames. The fire lit up the clearing, revealing the figures of Cletus and Boone on horseback at the edge of the woods, watching their handiwork. Boone raised a bottle in a mocking toast before they melted back into the darkness. They had lost everything. The cabin, their meager supplies, the little comfort they had built. All they had were the clothes on their backs and the 3 precious lockets that Isabella had managed to grab in the panic. Jed lay on the cold ground, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with the soft sobs of Isabella and the frightened cries of the children. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over him. Cain had won. They were homeless, defenseless, with winter approaching. He had failed. Isabella, sensing his despair, crawled over to him. "Jed," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "Look at me." He turned his head, his face black with soot, his eyes reflecting the flames. "We are alive," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She gestured to the 3 babies huddled in her arms. "They are alive. You saved us. A home can be rebuilt. A life cannot. You did not fail, Jedediah. You saved our lives." Her words, spoken amidst the ruins of his home, were a balm to his shattered spirit. He looked at her fierce, unwavering strength in the face of utter devastation. He looked at the 3 children, his children as he now thought of them. The despair receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in his bones. This was no longer a chess match of dams and intimidation. Cain had tried to murder them. He had tried to burn innocent children alive. "He's right," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "This ain't over." But he just made the biggest mistake of his life. Isabella looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" "He thinks he's broken us," Jed said, getting to his feet and staring at the dying flames of his cabin. "He thinks we're going to run. But we're not. We're going to go right back to where it all started. Right back into the belly of the beast." He turned to her, his pale blue eyes glowing with a dangerous light in the fire's reflection. "We're going back to Redemption Gulch." Under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness, Jed led Isabella and the children through the alleys of Redemption Gulch to the one door he hoped wouldn't be bolted Doc Miller's clinic. The old doctor roused from his sleep, saw the soot-stained family on his doorstep, and quickly ushered them inside, his face a mixture of pity and grim understanding. As the doctor tended to Jed's burns, Isabella frantically explained their plight. "There was proof," she said, her voice urgent. "My husband Antonio kept a ledger of Cain's crimes. I thought it was lost in the fire, but he gave it to the only other man he trusted, Gus O'Malley, the blacksmith." Hope flickered. Leaving Isabella and the children in the doctor's care, Jed slipped through the awakening town to the smithy. The giant blacksmith listened to Jed's story, his face an unreadable mask. Without a word, Gus pried up a floorboard, retrieved a heavy leather-bound book, and handed it over. "Antonio was a good man," Gus rumbled. "It's time the devil got his due." Back in the safety of the clinic, Jed opened the ledger. It was a meticulous record of Cain's evil homesteads, stolen through fraud families extorted, and a damning account of a diverted stream that led to an outbreak on a small farm. But as Jed turned to the final page, his blood ran cold. A late entry detailed the history of a former associate, a man named Elias Vance, whose wife and child had died in a suspicious cabin fire near the Black Hills after he was framed for a robbery orchestrated by Cain. The world stopped. Jedediah Stone was a name he'd taken to escape the past. His real name was Jedediah Vance. The story he'd told himself about a cholera epidemic was a lie to numb a pain too sharp to bear. Cain hadn't just built an empire on greed. He had built it on the ashes of Jed's home, on the graves of his wife Mary and his son Lucas. The grief he had carried for 5 years, detonated into a white-hot, focused rage. This was not chance. It was destiny. "Doc," Jed said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Get copies of these pages to Gus. Have him show the town the truth." He turned to Isabella. "Bar the door." "Jed, what will you do?" she pleaded. "I'm going to finish this," he said, and walked out into the main street. He strode directly into Kane's saloon and kicked the doors open. The room fell silent. Silas Kane, holding court at his usual table, smiled. "Stone," Kane said smoothly. "I heard you had some trouble with your cabin." Jed walked to the center of the room and threw the 3 map fragments to the floor. "The game is over, Kane. You want the map, it's yours. In exchange, you're going to tell everyone how you murdered my wife and son." Kane's smile vanished. "I don't know what you're—" "My name is Jedediah Vance." Jed roared, the name echoing like a gunshot in the saloon. At that exact moment, the doors swung open again. Gus stood there, shotgun in hand, flanked by a dozen armed and grim-faced townsmen. They had seen the ledger. With a snarl of fury, Kane overturned his table and drew his pistol. The saloon erupted. Jed dove for cover as the townsmen returned foot on Kane's henchmen. The fight was short and brutal. When the smoke cleared, only Jed and a wounded Kane remained. Jed advanced on him, his Colt Peacemaker leveled. "Vance!" Kane gasped, clutching a bleeding shoulder. The fire. It was just supposed to scare her off the claim. They weren't supposed to be there. It was a pathetic lie, and all the confession Jed needed. He stood over the man who had destroyed his world, the temptation for vengeance, a roaring fire in his soul. He saw his wife's face, heard his son's laugh. He could end it all. But then he thought of Isabella, of 3 small children, and a future. With a shuddering breath, he lowered his pistol. "No," Jed said, his voice ragged. "You'll stand trial. You'll live with what you've done." As Sheriff Brody finally appeared and slapped handcuffs on his defeated boss, Jed felt the weight of 5 years lift. The reckoning was over. Justice had won. The aftermath of the showdown left Redemption Gulch in a state of shock and quiet revolution. With Kane's empire of fear dismantled, the town began to breathe again. The ledger, authenticated by a circuit judge who rode in a week later, was an irrefutable testament to Kane's crimes. His conviction was swift and certain. Sentenced to life in the territorial prison, the man who had once been the town's absolute ruler was reduced to a ghost, his name spoken only in cautionary tales. Jedediah Vance, he had reclaimed his name, became an unlikely hero. But he wanted no part of the accolades. His war was over. His ghosts, if not gone, were at least quiet. His gaze was fixed on the future, a future that now included a brutto Italian woman and 3 small children who had taken up permanent residence in his heart. With the help of Gus Doc Miller and other grateful townsfolk, a new cabin was built for them. Not in the remote, lonely valley of Jed's past, but on a beautiful plot of land overlooking the town, a place where they could be part of the community that they had helped liberate. It was larger than Jed's old cabin, with a separate room for the children and a porch where Isabella could sit and watch the sunset. The map fragments, once a source of immense danger, were now a blueprint for hope. A month after Kane's arrest, Jed, Isabella, Gus, and Doc Miller saddled up and, using Antonio's ingenious map, found his legacy. The Viridian Valley was real. It was more magnificent than they had imagined, a lush green sanctuary carved out of the arid rock, the crystal-clear spring bubbling up from the earth like a promise. The claim, legally registered and now undisputed, belonged to Isabella and her children. It was their birthright, secured by their father's foresight and their mother's courage. But Isabella knew they could not build this future alone. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home, watching the triplets take their first wobbly steps in the yard, she turned to Jed. "This valley Antonio's dream. It's too much for one family," she said softly. "A paradise is meant to be shared. It should be a place for new beginnings for other families like ours." Jed looked at her, his heart swelling with a love and admiration that felt more real and profound than the grief he had carried for so long. He had found his own new beginning in her strength and compassion. "What do you have in mind, Isabella Rossi?" he asked, a genuine smile reaching his pale blue eyes. "I think," she said, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together naturally, "that Redemption Gulch needs a new name, and I think its future lies in that valley." And so it was. They drew up a charter offering plots of land in the Viridian Valley to homesteaders for a fair price with water rights guaranteed for all. Families began to arrive, not with the fear of a tyrant hanging over them, but with the hope of building a community. The town, renamed Viridian in honor of the valley that gave it new life, began to flourish. Jedediah Vance, the broken cowboy, found his purpose not in vengeance, but in building. He became a leader in the new town, his quiet wisdom and steady hand earning him the respect of all. But his most cherished role was that of a husband and father. He and Isabella were married by the circuit judge in a simple ceremony on the porch of their home, with the entire town in attendance. Samuel, Daniel, and Eliana, no longer the orphaned triplets of a begging woman, grew up strong and happy, knowing Jed as the only father they would ever need. He had not replaced their past, but he had built them a future. His life had been changed forever on that dusty afternoon. He had ridden into town seeking nothing and found everything. He had found a family to heal his broken heart, a community to belong to, and a love that was as deep and life-giving as the hidden spring in Antonio's valley. He had found redemption, not in the gulch of his past, but in the dawn of a new life. And so the story of Jedediah Vance and Isabella Rossi comes to a close. It's a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the heart of the Old West. It shows us that even in the dust of our deepest despair, a single act of kindness can spark a revolution, and that the deepest wounds can be healed by the love of a family you never expected to find. Jedediah thought his life was over, a long, lonely ride into the sunset. But what he found was a new sunrise, a future built not on forgetting the past, but on honoring it by building something better. Their story reminds us that heroes aren't always the fastest gun. Sometimes they're the ones brave enough to stop to listen and to offer a hand to those in need. If this story of love loss and redemption in the Wild West captured your heart, please let us know. Hit that like button to show your support. Share it with a friend who loves a classic Western tale, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true-life dramas from the pages of history. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.